The title of this particular section of the book of Esther is Before You Knew You Had a Need, God Already Provided. Alan and I talked about that this morning, how God has provided even before we knew we had a need. And so tonight as we begin the book of Esther, I want you to keep in mind what you've already learned about times of stress, where it began in the Garden of Eden and how God takes care of and tends to the times that we're going through a rough spell. When we get to the book of Esther, we see somebody who is going through that difficulty. Now, I'm only going to do chapter 1 to this week because I want to give you the background before I get into the story. This particular section is chapter 1 through chapter 2. So I want to look at chapter 1 and give you the background of Esther, who she is, and how the story came about. When we get together next week, we're going to pick up with Esther and Mordecai. One of my favorite passages of Scripture is when Mordecai looks at Esther and says, maybe it was for this time that you were born. Now, that tells us a whole lot. God takes us through things and many times gives us the opportunity to be the thing that changes the whole situation, whether it's in a family or a church or on our job. So it's one thing to perceive God's power. We all believe that God is powerful. It's one thing to perceive God's power, but it's another thing to trust God's power. We all would agree that God is a powerful God, but so many times we feel we don't feel confident enough in God's power to trust it when we go through difficult times. Now, these two principles of God's power and trusting God's power is the balance of the entire book of Esther. And it serves as a focus in these opening chapters, chapter 1 and chapter 2, which help us to understand that God is in control. In the most difficult of circumstances, God still kept His word to His people and made everything happen around them so that He could provide for them. So God is present and God is providentially working through everyday events in your life and my life. He's protecting and providing for His people in the book of Esther, just like He does us. So how did God's people, Israel, end up in Persia? As we begin this particular chapter, it gives us the background of and the timing of when the book of Esther was written and what was going on. Let me give you a little bit of background before we get into the first chapter. Judah, which was the southern kingdom, if you remember from your study of the divided kingdom, the southern kingdom and the northern kingdom, Judah was part of the southern kingdom, which had remained after the northern kingdom was taken off into captivity. The southern kingdom remained in Judah or in Israel for another about 100 years. So they were still there. And finally, in 605 BC, Babylon came in and took them away. So according to Jeremiah, if you read the book of Jeremiah, when you get to chapter 29, verses 1 through 14, you find that Jeremiah had already prophesied that Israel would stay in captivity for 70 years. That was a prophecy. As a matter of fact, as you read Daniel, you find that it was Jeremiah's prophecy that Daniel was reading when he realized they had already been in captivity for 70 years, and he began to tell them they needed to pack their suitcases. They were getting ready to go on a trip. So Jeremiah prophesied that it would be 70 years. Now, at that time, God raised up another power. It wasn't just Babylon, but the next power that took over Babylon was the empire of the Medes and the Persians, called the Medo-Persian Empire. The Medes and the Persians conquered Babylon in 539 BC. And under God's providential direction, it was Cyrus. Cyrus was the king of the Medes and the Persians that enacted a policy. He made an edict, as it were, that permitted the Jews to return to Israel. Remember, they're in captivity. They've been there for 70 years. But it was Cyrus who said, I want y'all to go back to your land, and I want you to establish the city again. And so we find here that the Jews returned and rebuilt the temple under the protective care. Now, if you write in your Bible, you should write at chapter 1 here to look at Ezra chapter 1. Ezra was we always talk about Nehemiah leading them back and building the temple. But Ezra was the first one to lead them back to help establish the city. Nehemiah came along to help them build the wall and the temple. So we start back in the book of Ezra, understanding the Jews coming back to the land. Now, let me say this to you. As we take a look at this, the period from 586, which started the date when Israel began to go back, and the destruction of Jerusalem until about 516 or 515 BC, when the temple project was actually completed. We find that 70 years beyond that was the year 444 BC. Now, as you're coming to the cross, the numbers go down. From the cross, the numbers go back up. All right? So from 516 BC to 444 BC is about 70 years. 70 years. And the reason I bring that up is because in 444 BC, there was a group of Jews that returned under the leadership of Nehemiah. Ezra had brought them back, had established the city, and now in 444 BC, it was Nehemiah who brought another group back to the city to rebuild the wall and to build the temple. Now, this was during the reign of a man by the name of Artaxerxes. He was the 5th king of Persia. Babylon was taken over by the Medes and the Persians, and then the Persians became the controlling factor. So it was Artaxerxes of Persia that sent Nehemiah back to then establish the wall and build the temple. So it was between the 2 points of 444 BC and 516 BC. It was between the time when they were sent back to the land to start building under Ezra and that time when another group was sent back under Nehemiah that the book of Esther was written. That's the reason I've given you those 2 points. So between those 2 comings, we find that the book of Esther was given to us. Now, the story reminds us that not all the Jews made that journey. Sometimes we think all the Jews made the journey back, but not all the Jews made the journey back into Israel. In fact, the majority of the Jews did not go back under Ezra or under Nehemiah. They were unwilling to undertake the difficult journey. If you take a look at your map, through that Fertile Crescent, they didn't want to have to make that journey, and they had already established their homes and generational places over a period of 70 years, and so they really didn't want to have to make that journey. Now, the story of Esther, as you begin to read it, begins and is played out in the city of Susa. That's the capital, the palace of the 4th king of Persia. Artaxerxes is the 5th king of Persia. So all of this begins under the 4th king of Persia. It's the story, and this is the wonderful part that I want you to remember. It is the story of God's providential care for his people, Israel. God had made them a promise. They were in bondage. They were out of the land, but God's going to keep his promise. It includes those who didn't seem concerned enough to make the trip back, along with those that had made the trip back and were beginning to rebuild the city. God took care of both. Now, let me say this. Whether they agreed with the theocratic rule of God, theo means God, God ruling, or under the Levitical laws and the temple worship, whether they agreed with that or not, had nothing to do with whether God took care of them or not. We find here that the question then baits itself, why would God show so much concern for those who showed no concern for him and remained in the land of Persia? Why would God take care of Israel in both places? It was because he had made a promise to provide a deliverer. Jeremiah had already prophesied that they would be delivered after 70 years of bondage because of their sin. So he had made a promise to provide for them, and because of that, they were what was about to happen in Susa was a threat to that promise. What was getting ready to happen to the Jews was a threat to God's provision to take care of them. They were fixing to have a massacre. And that's where Haman comes in. We're going to talk about Haman. And Mordecai found out about it, and he talked Esther into doing what the story is all about. So we find here that the nation was getting ready to be killed. The Holocaust of Haman. The nation was about to be massacred. But God was at work in Susa, the capital city of Persia, as well as in Jerusalem, where the remnants had gone to rebuild. God was working on both ends to preserve his people and to safeguard the promise that he had made to deliver his people and not let anyone destroy them. Now, though we find many interesting characters that are mentioned throughout the story, I think the most important actor in the book of Ezra is not even disclosed in print. The most important actor from page 1 to the end of the book is not even mentioned. Do you know who it is? God. God is not even mentioned in the book at all. Now, let me say this. His name appears nowhere in the book. Matter of fact, when they were putting the canon of Scripture together, that was one reason why the book of Esther wasn't included at first, because God's name was not found in the book. Now, we find here his providence, though, even though his name is not found in the book, God's providence is found every single page. How God led and God worked and God made everything work out according to his prophecies. And he accomplished his purpose in a pagan land as well as in the promised land. God's purpose was fulfilled in Jerusalem just as well as it was fulfilled in Susa. Now that's the background. So today we begin with the first point, talking about a defiant queen. This is the story and how the stage opens up and we see the story of what was going on. Let's begin then with the 6-month festival found in verses 1 through 4 of chapter 1. The 6-month festival. Notice what it says beginning in verse number 1. He says, "Now it came to pass in the days of Azarias," this is Azarias, which reigned from India even unto Ethiopia, over 127 provinces, "that in those days when King Azarias," we've talked about Artaxerxes, or who Azarias was, Azarias, we find, sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan, the palace. In the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast unto all the princes and his servants, the power of Persia and Media, the nobles and princes of the provinces being before him. And he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the honor of his excellent majesty many days, even 180 days. So this is a 6-month festival that he's put on. So as the story opens up, we find ourselves in the city of Susa, which is the winter palace, by the way, of Azarias, who is the king of Persia. That's who Israel was in bondage to. He's also known in the Greek language as Artaxerxes, so you may be more familiar with that name. His empire stretched from India, equivalent today to Punjab in Pakistan, from Pakistan all the way through Ethiopia, which is the northern part of Africa. That's how large the kingdom was, and it took up, according to the scripture, 127 provinces. So, a foundation tablet was discovered in his country. As a matter of fact, the historians of that day wrote this. They said, "Thus speaks King Artaxerxes. These are the countries, in addition to Persia, over which I am king under the shadow of Azarazus, India and Cush." So this is the history which was written about Artaxerxes. So the year was 482 BC, and 482 BC was the third year of Azarias' reign. And the king was preparing to wage a military campaign against Greece. He was planning a war. He was seeking revenge for the defeat of his own father, who had suffered at the hand of the Athenians in what was called the Battle of Marathon, which was in 490 BC. So in preparation for his campaign, he called together all the nobility, all the leaders of his vast kingdom, from Pakistan to Ethiopia. He called them all together, 127 provinces, called them all together. And during the festivities, which lasted 180 days, Artaxerxes displayed the splendor and the opulence of his great empire as they began to make their battle plans. This is what chapter 1 is all about. They're all together in this special time making battle plans. Did you know that Daniel prophesied this? In Daniel chapter 11 and verse number 2, this is what Daniel said. "And now will I show thee the truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia, and the 4th shall be richer, far richer than them all. And by his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Grecia." This is a prophecy written about exactly what you're studying that Artaxerxes is doing. He brought them all together, and they're making their battle plans. So there was a 6-month get-together party to be able to do that. 6-month festival. Then came a 7-day feast, found in verse 5 through 9. In verse 5 through 9, we want to read that. Beginning in verse number 5, he's talking about a feast that they began to throw. After this 6 months of putting together all the plans for this military campaign against Greece. Take a look at what the Bible says. "And when these days were expired," talking about the 180, "when these days were expired, the king made a feast unto all the people that were present in Shushan, the palace, both unto the great and small, 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace." And it says in verse 6, "Where were white and green and blue hangings fastened with cords of fine linen, and purple to silver rings and pillars and marble. And the beds were of gold and silver upon the pavements of red and blue and white and black and marble." Verse 7, "And they gave them drink in vessels of gold, the vessels being diverse one from the other, and royal wine in abundance according to the state of the king. And the drinking was according to the law. None did compel, for so the king had appointed to all the officers of the house, that they should do according to every man's pleasure. Also Vashti." Vashti is the king's wife. "Vashti, the queen, made a feast for the women in the royal house which belonged to King Ahasuerus. So, at the end of the 6-month festival, we find that Artaxerxes held a 7-day feast, according to verse number 5. Now, the term used in the original language actually meant a drinking feast. He held a 7-day drinking feast. The law neither compelled people to drink, according to verse 8, nor did it restrain people from drinking. But as he's saying here in verse 8, all the royal wine was presented in abundance during this 7-day drinking feast. The historian Herodotus noted that the Persians were extremely fond of wine, and they drank it in large amounts, especially when deliberating on important matters. So for 7 days, there was wine abundance while they deliberated on starting the war against the Greeks. Now, while the Persian queens usually ate at the king's table, Vashti would have normally been eating at the king's table. During times of great festivals, the ladies were separated from the men. So the men were in their drinking feast, and it says here in the verses that I just read that Vashti took the women out for their own get-together. So she is apart from them. Verse number 9. So here's the problem. Now we come to the husband-wife fight. You see what's happened? She's taken the ladies aside. What did he do to get himself in trouble? The stage is set for a major marital conflict. The first of several conflicts that served to set the stage for God's climactic deliverance of Israel. The stage is being set. The king communicated with the harem through a band of eunuchs. As the 7-day celebration drew to an end, Ahasuerus instructed his messengers to summon the queen to come to him and to take off her veil and prance around among all the men. A drunken crowd they were. He wanted her to show off her beauty as one of his trophies. Talk about trophy wife. She was his trophy wife. And he was going to show off all of her beauty. Take a look at verse 10 and 11. It says in verse 10, on the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry, he was drunk. His heart was merry with wine. He commanded Mehuman, Bethsa, Harbona, Bigtha, and Agatha, and Zethar, and Carcass. These are the eunuchs that I was talking about. The 7 chamberlains that served in the presence of Ahasuerus, the king, to bring Vashti, the queen, before the king with the crown royal. Bring your crown. Take your veil off. Put your crown on, to show the people and the princes her beauty, for she was fair to look on. He was proud of her as a trophy, and so he wanted her to show herself off. Now, the queen very wisely rejected this invitation. She very quickly rejected it. Most like the Islamic law today, Persian law forbade women to unveil themselves in front of strangers. Even today, Muslims will wear veils. The ladies will wear veils except before their husbands. And that's the way it was among the Persians. These were strangers. And certainly Vashti was not going to parade herself in the garden of a bunch of drunk men, much less take the veil off, which was against her conviction. So Vashti regarded her reputation and the integrity that she had of higher value than she did even her lofty position of being a queen. She was willing to pay whatever price the king enacted, but she was not going to lower her standards. The king was infuriated, the Bible teaches us. And having said that, I want you to stroll down to verse 16 for a minute. We find here, before you get to verse 16, in verse 13, He says in verse 13, then the king said to the wise men which knew the times, for so was the king's manner toward all that knew law and judgment. I want you to notice those words, wise men which knew the times. What that means is the king went over to his astrologers and his magi, and in addition to being men who knew the customs of the laws of the Medes and the Persians, these were also the wise men of the area. They were the royal advisors that served the king in close association. These were the king's counselors that he went to. We know them as astrologers. We know them as magi. And by the way, later on, they were also the ones that caused him problems. So even back then, they had leaders in the church that caused them trouble, right? So here the advisors were concerned for the queen's conduct. These wise men, they were concerned that the queen was doing this. And what would be, if it became public knowledge, what would happen among the kingdom? The possibility existed that all the women of all the men in the kingdom would see that they could exert their independence. And the men couldn't have that, because then there'd be an uprising. Memucan, speaking on behalf of all of them, beginning in verse 16, offered a solution. We can't have it. Here's my solution, both for the private problem between husband and wife and the potential public problem of this getting out, that women could get away with it. All right? Start looking at verse 16. And Memucan answered before the king and the princes, Vashti the queen hath not done wrong to the king only, but also to all the princes and all the people that are in the provinces of the king. Asarias, for this deed of the queen shall come abroad unto all women, so that they shall despise their husbands in their eyes. They're going to disobey their husbands. We can't have that, right? In their eyes, when it shall be reported, the king Azarias commanded Vashti the queen to be brought in before him, but she came not. How about that? Likewise shall the ladies of Persia and Media say this day unto all the king's princes, which have heard the deeds of the queen, thus shall there arise too such contempt and wrath. If it pleases the king, let there go a royal commandment from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, that it too be not altered, that Vashti come no more before King Azarias, and let the king give her royal estate unto another that is better than she. And the king's decree which he shall make shall be published throughout all the empire, for it is great. All the wives shall give to their husbands honor, both great and small. Now, the proposal had two parts. First of all, to have Vashti removed and replaced as the queen, verse number 19. And the second part was to publish a decree that all the wives throughout all the 127 provinces would have to honor their husbands by decree. It's against the law not to honor your husband. Verse 20. For husbands were to rule their home according to this decree. Now, he was pleased with the council. The king made this decree. And according to the unalterable nature of Persian law, which we read about in the book of Ezra and in the book of Daniel, the king's words were sealed and then sent by Pony Express throughout all the provinces, throughout the whole entire empire. Translated as necessary, it was delivered in every language in all the kingdom. Women, you can't disobey your husband. It's against the law. This went throughout all of them. So now we come to the second part of our story, and that is a delinquent quest. For this, we turn over to chapter 2 for just a minute. In chapter 2, I want to look at the first part of chapter 2 down through verse 4, and then we're going to pick up with verse 5 next week when we get into the meat of this story. In chapter 2, we see the delinquent quest. Take a look at what it says, beginning in verse 1. And after these things, which the wrath of King Ahasuerus was appeased, he was happy because he had made the law. He was appeased. He remembered Vashti and what she had done and what was decreed against her. And then the king said the king's servants that ministered unto him, let there be a fair young virgin sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of the kingdom, that they may gather together all the fair young virgins unto Shushan the palace, to the house of the women, unto the custody of Hedge the king's chamberlain, keeper of the women, and let the things for purification be given them. And let the maiden which passeth the king be the queen instead of Vashti, and the thing pleased the king, and he did so. All right, now I want you to notice this phrase. We're talking about back up in the early part. Let me back up just a minute. He says at the very beginning, after these things, and then he later on said, he remembered. Now notice those words back in verse number 1. That phrase, after these things, he remembered, encompasses 4 years. 4 years. From the time Vashti was demoted in the 3rd year of the king's reign until the promotion of Esther in the 7th year of the king's reign. And during that gap of time, Ahasuerus went to war with Greece. For 4 years, he went to war against Greece in this period of time. A lot of time between chapter 1 and chapter 2. Now, during that gap, Ahasuerus was at war with Greece, and he spent 4 years building his tremendous war machine. And then he went and engaged Greece for 2 years. 2 years he was at war. And the military campaign that began in the spring of 481 BC ended in a staggering loss for Ahasuerus in 479 BC. And his vast army and his big navy were humiliated in the 2 years against Greece. So he comes back home with his tail between his legs. He's demoralized. He's depressed from failing in avenging his father's defeat. The king began to recall the affection of his former queen, Vashti, and his companionship. He didn't have a woman's shoulder to cry on. He didn't have anybody to stroke his brow and to say, that's all right, you're still a handsome man. And so he began to feel sorry for himself. And in an effort to bolster the king's fallen spirit, his servants proposed that there be a search for a brand new queen, that it would begin at once. And they recommended a very unique plan. You read about it. Instead of selecting a queen from the small pool of virgins within his harem, let's have a beauty contest in the 127 provinces, and just everybody put up a candidate for queen for a day, and bring it and put that queen in the harem to be watched, and the king Ahasuerus could go among them and personally pick out the one that he wanted out of all the queens that were there. Who would he choose? Who would he choose from among all the women of the kingdom? A lot of men probably like that problem. You got all the women you can choose from. Who do you want? And that's what happened to Ahasuerus. Who would win against those kind of odds? Well, that brings us then to verse number 5. In verse 5, we're going to really begin with this next week, the delightful queen. This is where Esther comes on the scene. But I want you to take a look before we quit at verse 5. At verse 5 in chapter 2, it says, Now in Shushan, the palace, there was a certain Jew, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shema, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. So now we get to the story. I spent all of this time to give you the uplink as to why the book of Esther was written. Now you see what's getting ready to befall the Israelites. Now you see what was happening in the household of Ahasuerus, the Persian. Now you see why he's got his lip poked out, because he came home having been defeated by the Greeks, and he didn't have a queen to cry on. And so the men said, let's bring these women, and you can pick the one you want. Now, the reason that's so important is because Esther was one of those women. And God, in his providence, to save his people Israel, had him choose Esther. What a story of God's power and God's providence. And we're going to start it next week. Shall we stand?